Hello, my name is Brian Donnie. I'm a senior philosophy major at Franciscan University of Steubenville, and my paper is entitled Kant's Ethical Impetus Behind the Prolegomena. As a philosophy paper, this may seem a little less practical than some of the other topics discussed at the conference, but I think that Kant's writings on ethics have been immensely influential for our own understanding of ethics today, our understanding of freedom and the rational basis for morality. So here goes. A typical caricature of Immanuel Kant derides his metaphysics as skeptical solipsism and his ethics as regurgitated stoicism. In such trivializing of Kant's insights, however, one misses the essential telos or goal of his philosophy, namely the preservation of religion and morality. Accordingly, while the narrative of Kant's dispute with the Leibnizian Wolffian school has filled numerous commentaries, readers are often left unaware of a more fundamental question looming over Kant's head, namely, in the age of reason, is morality still possible? This one question drives both the metaphysical and the ethical treatises of Kant. The former represents a negative task, the restriction of reason, and the latter a positive one, the foundation of ethics. Thus, the question of morality is inextricably bound to the renowned problem of synthetic a priori judgments, and together they can be seen as a single unified movement in Kant's thought. In imposing grave limitations upon speculative reason, Kant shifts the focus to practical reason, which ultimately vindicates God, freedom, and morality. Moreover, this unified reading of Kant's work sheds light on the true character of his ethics, which focuses not upon an impersonal universal law as such, but upon the embodied moral person who deserves respect as an end in himself. As a young scholar, Kant writes unequivocally in favor of the metaphysical optimism of Leibniz and the German Enlightenment, in particular Christian Wolff, who endeavors to show that reason comprehends the whole of reality. However, after exchanging a series of letters with Johann Georg Hamann, who exposes him to the skeptical empiricism of David Hume, Kant begins to rethink his optimistic treatment of rationality. Hamann himself had been converted from the German Enlightenment's belief in the supremacy of reason to the Lutheran doctrine of the frailty of reason. Hamann challenges the authority of reason, the Enlightenment's sovereign standard of truth, and thus arouses Kant's suspicion of reason's ability to answer traditional metaphysical questions. This suspicion is exacerbated by Kant's own reading of Hume, who awakens him from his, quote, dogmatic slumber. In the final outcome, Kant will take the side of Hamann against Leibniz in subjecting reason to strenuous limits, while simultaneously rejecting Hume's conclusion that metaphysics is impossible. Kant's ambition, however, reaches beyond the founding of an authentically scientific metaphysics, but coincides with the ultimate goal of the German Enlightenment, which is to wrench morality, religion, and the organized state from the grasp of tradition and reestablish them upon rational foundations. But in the late 18th century, the Enlightenment, while varying considerably in its individual manifestations, invariably threatens to eradicate all three from human life. No force seems capable of preventing reason from marching against all existing customs and annihilating them entirely. Kant devises a plan then to preserve rationalism without the consequences of atheism, fatalism, and materialism in 18th century Germany. But in order to save the possibility of morality, he must challenge the basic assumption of the German Enlightenment's supreme court, the speculative function of reason. In other words, he must critique the critic, reason itself. A cursory overview of the Prolegomena's, his work, The Prolegomena and Any Future Metaphysics, a cursory overview of the Prolegomena's argument will introduce Kant's solution to the problem of morality. Kant assumes David Hume's analysis of experience, which reduces the content of cognition to chaotic sense impressions. According to Hume, seemingly universal and necessary truths, such as cause and effect, are in fact the result of habituation to empirical generalities, or as Kant calls them, bastards of the imagination. This perturbs Kant because he discovers necessary truths in experience which are not derived from experience. In other words, Kant's famous synthetic a priori judgments. The task of the Prolegomena then is to demonstrate that the objectivity of the world is not native to the world, but lies beforehand in the mind. When mind comes into contact with the world conforms to the predetermined templates dormant in the mind. This means that our sense impressions necessarily appear in space and time, and our understanding organizes thoughts in terms of quantity, quality, etc., but these do not belong to the world in itself. Human knowledge knows objects insofar as they appear, phenomena, but not independently of the a priori forms and categories, in other words, as they are in themselves. The finale of the Prolegomena explicates the three transcendental ideas of reason, namely the soul, the cosmos, and God. First, Kant argues that we experience the self primarily as the receptor for phenomena, We do not know the substance underlying these phenomenal experiences of sensing and understanding, what he calls the noumenal self, least of all whether such a substance abides after death. Here, Kant concedes to materialism, but only for the world of appearances. Second, Kant compiles reasons for antitheses about the cosmos pertaining to its beginning, elemental constitution, causality, and contingency. In each case, reason is trapped between equally plausible arguments. For example, did the world have a beginning in time, or did it always exist? The third antithesis applies especially to the question of morality, as Kant makes another concession, this time to fatalism or determinism. There is no room for freedom in the phenomenal world, which is governed by necessary Newtonian scientific laws. Finally, Kant concedes to atheism, again with respect to the phenomenal world, arguing that reason invents a supreme being to satisfy its own need to subject experience to ultimate order and unity. Consequently, reason's attempt to transcend sense experience only serves to demonstrate its own limitations. While reason necessarily contrives the ideas of God, freedom, and the soul, it has no ability to prove their existence because they have no referent in empirical experience. True metaphysics then can elucidate the a priori conditions of experience as such, but cannot trespass to questions of the supreme being or human freedom. Thus, he removes traditional metaphysics from the equation entirely, boldly objecting that God, freedom, and the immortality of the soul have nothing to do with metaphysics. After all, the majority of people adhere to these beliefs, who adhere to these beliefs, adhere to them for their practical implications in the first place. Kant, in erecting an impassable dam against the flow of theoretical argumentation, channels the question into the domain of practical reason. In his fundamental principles, the metaphysics of morals, Kant puts forward a trans-empirical foundation for moral behavior, namely the rational law. Only the will that acts according to law for duty's sake may be called good, he writes. In purifying ethics of all that reeks of inclination, desire, eudaimonism, and private interest, he believes that he has laid a sure foundation for the authentically ethical life. However, many have criticized Kant on this point, accusing him of rendering moral activity highly impersonal and the law a rigid code fit only for stoic automatons wholly devoid of feeling. If such is the case, then the individual moral agent seems stripped of his robust humanity. On the contrary, Kant's law-based ethics provides the key to understanding his personalistic argument in fundamental principles. It is the supremacy of law which sheds light on Kant's otherwise bewildering doctrine that the person and the law are both the end goal of moral action. We have already seen Kant insisting that personal interest falls short as a criterion for moral judgment. The question remains whether the individual person is reduced to an automaton by Kant's rationalistic law. Kant, despite his crusade against sentimentality, retains one peculiar feeling, that of reverence toward the moral law. A passage from the expanded volume of Kant's Ethics, The Critique of Practical Reason, elucidates this very point. Kant writes, "Reverence applies always to persons, never to things. Fontenelle says, 'I bow before an outstanding man, but my mind does not bow.' I would add, before an unimportant ordinary man, in whom I perceive uprightness of character in a higher degree than I am conscious of in myself, my mind does bow, whether or not I want to do so. Why is this? Because his example exhibits to me a law that humbles my self-conceit when I compare it with my conduct, a law of the practicality of obedience, which I see proved by the deed before my eyes." Thus, Kant answers the objection that humans have been subjected to an impersonal, heteronymous force. Because the law is derived from human reason, the law is personal. The reverence due to the law is reverence shown to concrete individuals who, so to speak, impersonate the law. Reverence stands apart from other feelings insofar as it is not a carnal inclination, but a bowing of the mind, that is, of reason itself, which recognizes the law of reasons in persons. This demonstrates the consistency within Kant's insistence that the law is the only suitable end of moral action, and yet rational nature is an end in itself. The dignity of the person for Kant, then, is the dignity of the moral person. A life lived according to the law inspires reverence in another rational being. Because the person has the capacity for living an upstanding moral life, he cannot be used, quote, merely as a means. This moral life precludes automation, for it presupposes autonomy, which becomes the ultimate source of personal dignity because it weds freedom and the life of practical, lawful goodness. Although freedom belongs to the world of noumena, not phenomena, it is necessarily presupposed in a moral life. Rational nature cannot escape asserting its freedom in action. Thus, Kant returns to the question of freedom, which he last addressed in the concluding pages of Prolegomena. Here, Kant rescues freedom from the grip of determinism by arguing that although reason cannot prove freedom metaphysically, it necessarily assumes its own power as an uncaused cause in moral activity. Kant's argument begins with the limitation of reason to the forming and organizing of empirical data, proceeds to the universalizing power of practical reason as the basis for ethics, and concludes with the incarnated law, who is the moral agent or person. This solution carries with it two advantages. First, he lays the foundation for the moral life upon rationality, the originator of the universal law, which ensures its consistency with the aims of the German Enlightenment, and yet demonstrates that enlightened reasoning does not eradicate traditional morality, but reinforces it. Second, the person is not neglected, for although Kant is hardly concerned with individuality as such, the individual participates in the law so intimately that an encounter with the moral person amounts to an encounter with the supreme law itself. In positing the law as the formal condition of ethical behavior, duty does not conflict with the individual person as an end, because the proper end of moral action, pure law, is embodied in his ethical life. The law dwells in man with vitality, not degrading his nature, but elevating it through freedom beyond the determinism of subpersonal nature. Kant's meticulous analysis of reason thus appears in a more favorable light, so long as one recognizes that it surges forth from experience of a phenomenon mirabile visu, the moral life. Thank you.